At 84 years old, Paul Anka has lived a life most can only dream of. A singer, songwriter, and performer who rose to fame as a teenager, he has crossed paths with legends from Frank Sinatra to Elvis Presley. But among all the names and faces, one figure has always stood apart for him: Marilyn Monroe. For decades, Paul kept his memories of her locked away, choosing not to reveal the details of what he saw, what he heard, and what he felt during those fleeting but unforgettable encounters. But now, with the weight of age and the wisdom of hindsight, he finally opens up. His words are not just about Marilyn the star, but about Norma Jean, the woman behind the image. And what he reveals is not the glamorous Hollywood fantasy the world has clung to. It is something raw, emotional, and deeply human. For the first time, Paul Anka tells his truth about Marilyn Monroe, and the revelations may change the way you see her forever. It was the late 1950s, and Paul Anka was barely out of his teens when fame came crashing down on him like a tidal wave. With Diana topping charts around the world, he suddenly found himself thrust into a glittering world of stardom that seemed untouchable to the average person. Hollywood had opened its golden gates, and Anka was one of its newest guests. At the same time, Marilyn Monroe was already a cultural phenomenon. She wasn't just a movie star, she was the embodiment of allure, glamour, and tragedy all rolled into one. Everywhere she went, people stopped in awe. To the world, she was untouchable, but behind the lights, she was searching for real connections, people who would see her for more than just the blonde bombshell on screen. Paul remembered the first time he saw her as if it were yesterday. It wasn't on a movie set or at a red carpet premiere, but at an intimate Hollywood gathering where stars mingled freely without scripts or spotlights. Marilyn walked in, and the entire room shifted. She had that rare kind of presence, gentle but commanding, vulnerable yet magnetic. For Paul, a young man navigating fame, the sight of her was both overwhelming and unforgettable. Their introduction was simple: mutual friends, casual conversation, the kind of meeting one might expect in the small circle of Hollywood elite. But what surprised Paul was how genuine she was. Beneath the beauty, there was an almost childlike innocence in the way she laughed, in the way she asked questions about his music and career. Marilyn had met countless celebrities, but with Anka, she wasn't the diva or the screen siren. She was just a woman curious about a young singer making his way in the world. Paul would later describe this encounter not as a brush with Hollywood royalty, but as a moment where two human beings, one at the start of his journey, the other already weighed down by the burdens of her fame, crossed paths. It wasn't a long or elaborate interaction, but it left an impression that would last a lifetime. For Anka, Marilyn wasn't just another name in his long list of acquaintances. She represented something deeper, the fragility hidden within fame. And though he didn't know it then, this first meeting would spark memories he would carry with him for more than 6 decades. To the outside world, Marilyn Monroe was the definition of perfection. Her photographs graced magazine covers, her films broke box office records, and her smile could light up an entire theater. But Paul Anka, even in his brief encounters with her, began to notice what few dared to acknowledge at the time. Behind the dazzling exterior was a woman in constant conflict with herself. He recalled how Marilyn had a way of turning on her charm like a light switch. Around crowds, she was luminous, every glance choreographed, every giggle perfectly timed. Yet, when the crowd's attention shifted away, her expression changed, almost as though she had slipped out of character and returned to being Norma Jean, the girl from Los Angeles, who had been swept up into a world she never fully belonged to. Paul remembered her silences most of all, while others would fill conversations with stories of fame, parties, and wealth. Marilyn often drifted into quiet moments, as if her mind was somewhere far away. She seemed fascinated by music, especially the emotional honesty in Paul's songs. He would later reflect that perhaps she admired music because it had the ability to express vulnerability in a way Hollywood never allowed her to. But with that fascination came melancholy. Paul noticed a fragility in her eyes, a loneliness that fame could never cure. She was surrounded by people constantly: agents, producers, photographers, and admirers, but somehow she looked lonelier than anyone in the room. It struck Paul deeply, even as a young man, that Marilyn was trapped in an endless performance. The world loved Marilyn Monroe, but few cared to know Norma Jean. Anka sensed the exhaustion in her voice when she spoke about her career, the pressure of always being told how to act, how to look, how to smile. She was at once the most admired woman in the world and the most misunderstood. For Paul, these private glimpses into her real self were unforgettable. Behind the glamour, she wasn't the confident goddess people imagined. She was human, vulnerable, and at times heartbreakingly lost. Paul would later admit that he often thought about her when reflecting on the dangers of fame, how adoration could be both a gift and a prison. And for Marilyn Monroe, that prison had bars no one else could see. What Paul Anka remembered most vividly about Marilyn Monroe weren't the glamorous entrances, the laughter echoing at Hollywood parties, or the blinding flash of cameras. It was the private, quieter moments that revealed who she truly was. He recalled conversations that felt almost out of place in the glittering world they both inhabited. Marilyn would often steer their talks away from fame and into the kind of subjects that showed she longed for something deeper. She would ask Paul about his songwriting, how he managed to put raw emotion into lyrics that resonated with millions. She seemed captivated by the idea that music could tell truths that acting often concealed. Sometimes she'd confess that she wished she could be more like that, real, unfiltered, free from the constant demand to be Marilyn. There were moments when she let her guard down entirely, and it was in those moments Paul saw a woman who craved genuine connection. She spoke of her struggles with love and trust, how the men in her life often saw her as a symbol rather than a person. Paul listened as she admitted her fear of being forgotten, of fading away once the lights went out. For a woman adored by millions, she carried an astonishing insecurity that shocked him. He described her as having a fragile honesty, the kind that would make you stop and realize you weren't speaking with a legend, but with a human being desperate to be understood. One memory stayed with Paul more than the rest. Marilyn, after a long evening, leaned in and said something he would never forget. "Everyone loves Marilyn Monroe, but who will love me when I'm not her?" It was a haunting statement, a window into the torment of someone living two lives, one for the world and one she could barely manage in private. For Paul, those words carried a weight he would remember for the rest of his life. They revealed the essence of the woman beneath the image, vulnerable, fearful, but deeply yearning for something real. These private moments, fleeting as they were, left Paul with an understanding of Marilyn that few others had. She wasn't just a star caught in the glare of Hollywood's spotlight. She was a woman searching for authenticity, trapped in a role she could never fully escape. And to Paul, that truth was far more powerful than any performance she ever gave on screen. When Paul Anka looked back on Marilyn Monroe's career, one thing became painfully clear to him. Hollywood didn't just create her, it consumed her. To the outside world, Marilyn was the ultimate success story. A girl from humble beginnings who became the most famous woman in the world. But Paul, even in his youth, could see the darker side of that narrative. The Hollywood machine treated her less like a person and more like a product. Executives, directors, and publicists molded every part of her identity, deciding how she should look, speak, and even think. Paul remembered hearing stories about how studios would schedule her every move, right down to what she ate and where she appeared. Behind the camera, Marilyn wasn't free, she was owned. Anka, as a rising star in the music business, saw similarities in how artists were treated in his own world, but with Marilyn, it was magnified 100 times. She was marketed not just as an actress, but as the very embodiment of desire, and Hollywood relentlessly profited from that image. To keep that illusion alive, they ignored her growing struggles, her fragile mental health, and her desperate attempts to be taken seriously as more than a pin-up girl. Marilyn yearned to be respected as a serious actress. She admired writers, intellectuals, and musicians, often surrounding herself with people who could challenge her mind rather than simply admire her beauty. But the industry rarely allowed that side of her to be seen. Paul would later say that Marilyn had two constant battles, one with herself and one with the system that controlled her. He believed the industry stripped her of the very things she craved: authenticity, control, and dignity. Instead, it forced her deeper into loneliness and self-doubt. What struck Paul the most was how Marilyn seemed aware of the trap but powerless to escape it. She once admitted to him in a quiet exchange that she felt like a commodity, a name on a marquee rather than a human being. Those words haunted Paul because he knew she was right. Hollywood was never designed to protect someone like Marilyn Monroe. It was designed to use her until there was nothing left to give. For Paul Anka, reflecting on her life decades later, this realization was perhaps the most tragic part of all. The same industry that made Marilyn a legend was the very thing that destroyed her. For decades, Paul Anka carried certain memories of Marilyn Monroe in silence. He had seen things, heard things, and felt things that he believed the world wasn't ready to hear until now. In his youth, Paul had been shocked by how different Marilyn was once the cameras disappeared. While the world saw her as radiant, he sometimes saw her broken. She confided in him, and though he was young, he understood that what she shared was too delicate to be used for gossip or headlines. One of the secrets Paul held close was the depth of Marilyn's isolation. She admitted to him that despite being surrounded by people, she often felt invisible. The men who claimed to love her, powerful actors, politicians, moguls, were enamored with the idea of Marilyn Monroe, not Norma Jean. To Paul, that distinction was heartbreaking. He recalled her once lowering her voice and saying, "They don't want to know me. They only want what I represent." Those words stayed with him his entire life. Paul also witnessed Marilyn's reliance on pills and alcohol, though in his day, such matters were rarely spoken of openly. She struggled to keep up the appearance of joy, while quietly battling exhaustion and dependency. To the public, she sparkled. To those close enough to glimpse behind the facade, she seemed constantly on the edge of collapse. Another secret Paul kept was her longing for a family. While others saw her as the ultimate seductress, she confessed her heartbreak over failed relationships, miscarriages, and the nagging feeling that she was destined to always be alone. Anka later admitted that Marilyn carried a sadness that no amount of applause could erase. He knew her words were not rehearsed or exaggerated. They were the cries of someone who desperately wanted a life beyond Hollywood's suffocating spotlight. He also remembered the way she spoke about power in Hollywood, how executives used her, discarded her, and threatened her whenever she tried to assert independence. Paul never repeated those confessions at the time, perhaps out of fear of retaliation from an industry that punished truth-tellers. Instead, he kept them locked away in his memory, guarded like fragile glass. Now, at 84, Paul reveals that Marilyn Monroe wasn't just destroyed by fame or bad luck, she was undone by a system that never saw her as a person. The secrets he carried all these years weren't meant to scandalize, but to humanize her. They paint a picture of a woman far more complex than the world ever imagined. When Paul Anka spoke about Marilyn's final days, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the storm building long before it broke. Though their interactions were limited, he recalled the growing whispers in Hollywood during the early 1960s, rumors of Marilyn's instability, her dependence on pills, and her entanglements with powerful men whose names were whispered but rarely written down. Paul remembered that even when she appeared at public events, there was something noticeably different about her. The sparkle in her eyes seemed dimmer, her famous smile harder to sustain. To him, it felt as though she was living on borrowed time, pushing through each appearance with less energy, as though the performance of Marilyn Monroe was draining the life from Norma Jean. What haunted Paul most was the contrast. In private moments, she had confided her exhaustion, her fear that she was becoming a burden to those around her. She longed for peace, for a sense of belonging, yet she was surrounded by people who viewed her as a commodity. Her final phone calls, her erratic behavior on movie sets, her sudden disappearances from public appearances, all of it suggested a woman unraveling, struggling against forces too powerful to overcome. Paul often wondered whether Marilyn sensed what was coming. He described her as someone who seemed to be looking over her shoulder, as if chased by shadows the rest of the world couldn't see. Some say she was haunted by her failed marriages. Others point to her rumored affairs with the Kennedy brothers, while still others believe the Hollywood machine itself was complicit in her downfall. Paul didn't claim to know the full truth, but he admitted there were conversations Marilyn had with him that hinted at a deep despair. He recalled her once saying that sometimes she wished she could disappear, to walk away from it all, and live quietly, where no one would expect her to be perfect. When news broke on August 5, 1962, that Marilyn Monroe had been found dead at just 36 years old, Paul was shaken to his core. Like millions around the world, he was devastated. But unlike most, he knew that behind the headlines was a woman who had cried for help long before her final night. He kept his thoughts private then, refusing to fuel speculation. But deep down, he always believed her death was the tragic conclusion of a life suffocated by fame, loneliness, and the relentless pressures of an industry that refused to see her humanity. For Paul Anka, Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a passing memory from his youth. She became a symbol of what fame could do to a person's soul. In the decades after her death, as his own career soared and evolved, he often found himself thinking back to those brief but powerful encounters with her. They left an imprint that never faded. Paul admitted that Marilyn changed the way he looked at success. While others chased wealth and adoration, he was reminded of the emptiness that could lie beneath the applause. Seeing Marilyn's struggles firsthand made him wary of the illusions of celebrity. It taught him to value control over his own career, to never let the industry dictate every part of his life the way it had dictated hers. He would later confess that some of the choices he made, whether it was walking away from certain contracts, pushing back against executives, or reinventing himself when the industry tried to box him in, were all influenced by the ghost of Marilyn Monroe. She became, in a sense, a silent guide for him, a warning etched into his conscience. But it wasn't just professional lessons. On a personal level, Paul carried with him the sadness of what he had seen in her, the loneliness, the yearning to be loved for who she really was. That memory made him more protective of the relationships in his own life. It reminded him not to take real connections for granted. Marilyn's fate became a mirror he held up whenever fame threatened to pull him away from authenticity. In interviews years later, Paul would sometimes speak vaguely about the darker side of show business, but he rarely mentioned Marilyn by name. Out of respect, he kept her secrets, but she was always there in the background of his thoughts. Even as he wrote timeless songs for legends like Sinatra and Tom Jones, and as he reinvented his career for new generations, the memory of Marilyn remained a quiet undertone in his story. He often wondered if things might have been different had Hollywood treated her with more compassion. Would she have lived longer, found true happiness, been remembered not as a tragedy, but as a triumph? Those questions haunted him. At 84, when Paul finally opened up, it wasn't to sensationalize her memory, but to share the lessons he learned from her life. Marilyn Monroe taught him, without ever meaning to, that fame is a fragile bargain, one that can give you the world while quietly taking your soul. When Paul Anka finally decided to speak openly about Marilyn Monroe, more than 6 decades had passed since her untimely death. At 84 years old, he knew he wasn't just sharing a story. He was sharing a piece of history, a perspective that only someone who had been there could give. For years, he chose silence, out of respect. He feared that revealing too much would turn Marilyn's memory into tabloid fodder, the very thing she had spent her life trying to escape. But as time went on, Paul realized that silence, too, could be a kind of betrayal. He had seen a side of her the world didn't know, and he believed it was finally time to tell that truth. Paul explained that Marilyn was not the flawless goddess history had painted her to be, nor was she merely the tragic victim of conspiracy theories and scandal. She was, in his words, a human being caught in the middle of a storm she never asked for. His memories stripped away the mythology, and replaced it with something far more haunting: authenticity. He remembered her laughter, her insecurities, her confessions whispered in quiet corners. He remembered the way she seemed to glow when people adored her but fall silent when she feared they only loved the illusion. To Paul, Marilyn wasn't a mystery. She was painfully clear. She wanted what everyone wants: love, acceptance, and peace. The tragedy was that she sought those things in an industry built to deny them. When asked why he waited so long to speak, Paul admitted it took him decades to process what he had seen. In his own career, he had to navigate fame, exploitation, and pressure. He survived, but not without scars of his own. Looking back, he realized that everything Marilyn had feared, everything she had warned him about in those private moments, was true. Fame is a double-edged sword. It can give you the world, but it rarely gives you freedom. As he spoke about her in later interviews, Paul's voice carried both reverence and sorrow. He did not want to sensationalize her death or rehash the endless debates about whether it was an overdose, an accident, or something darker. For him, the real tragedy wasn't how she died, it was how she lived. A life of constant scrutiny, loneliness in crowded rooms, and a desperate need for authenticity that Hollywood never allowed her to have. Paul ended his reflections with a bittersweet truth. Marilyn Monroe will always be remembered, but not always for the right reasons. The world remembers the icon, the blonde bombshell, the scandal, and the mystery, but few remember the woman, the one who listened to music late into the night, who longed for family, who cried over being misunderstood, and who once asked a young singer if anyone would love her when she wasn't Marilyn. At 84, Paul Anka finally broke his silence, not to add to the myths, but to give Marilyn the humanity she was so often denied. His truth was simple but powerful. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a legend, nor just a tragedy. She was a person. And perhaps, if the world had cared more about Norma Jean than Marilyn, her story might have ended differently. And so, after 60 years, Paul Anka's words echo as both a confession and a warning. Fame is fleeting, but the human heart, the need to be truly seen, remains eternal.